Your lecturer is Paul Rosenzweig, J.D. Mr. Rosenzweig is a professorial lecturer in law at the George Washington University Law School, where he lectures on cybersecurity law and policy. He is a graduate of the University of Chicago Law School. Mr. Rosenzweig formerly served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and is the founder of Red Branch Consulting, PLLC, a Homeland Security consulting company. He is the author of Cyber Warfare: How Conflicts in Cyberspace Are Challenging America and Changing the World.
On the evening of March 10th, 2004, as a light drizzle fell, Attorney General John Ashcroft lay in a hospital bed at George Washington University in the Foggy Bottom section of the nation's capital. He was recovering from emergency pancreatic surgery. The events in that hospital room still resonate today. Gathered around the Attorney General were some of President George W. Bush's most important advisors, each of them a vital cog in the U.S. war on terror, then operating at a very high clip. They included White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card, FBI Director Robert Mueller, the Deputy Attorney General of the Department of Justice James Comey, who later became FBI Director under President Obama, and others. At issue was the answer to a relatively simple but incredibly important question. Could the United States conduct an effective global counterterrorism surveillance program under U.S. law? Or were effective surveillance and the rule of law essentially incompatible? And therein lies the fundamental tension of this course. How, if at all, can the United States of America engage in meaningful surveillance to maintain national security and defend the Republic without at the same time threatening privacy and civil liberty? You, no doubt, are interested in this question and have probably formed some of your own answers. I have opinions myself, which I will share as the course goes along. But my promise is that as we talk about surveillance, privacy, civil liberties, transparency, and national security, I'll try my best to give you the necessary legal and policy background to arrive at your own informed conclusions. Let me begin by outlining the themes we will address throughout this course. First, we'll talk about how technology often trumps the law. That is the phenomenon that everyday life legal rules often trail the development and application of technology. And as a consequence, private actors, by introducing new technologies and applications, frequently establish our standards for their use. Second, we'll discuss how the public relies on certain delegated and at times even self-appointed protectors of their liberties, rather than rely on themselves. In this, I'm referring to such delegated protectors as Congress, the courts, and even third-party private interest groups. Third, we'll talk about what I call the clash of institutions. That is, the idea that much of what passes for law is really more the product of conflicting institutional imperatives than of legal controls through statutes, regulations, or court decisions. And if you haven't heard of Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange by now, it's unlikely that you're actually taking this course. I suspect that almost everybody has heard of these individuals. Although if you haven't, we'll introduce you to them. They're individuals who have emerged as uncensored conduits to channel sensitive government classified information to mass audiences via new technologies. First is the idea that technology often trumps the law. Part of the struggle to define acceptable surveillance practices arises from the fact that we are continually trying to apply relatively old laws and legal interpretations to relatively new technologies. Often, the underlying legislation was written 10, 20, 30, sometimes even 40 years ago. In a world in which technology changes as rapidly as it does, it is unreasonable, indeed almost nonsensical, to expect old laws to fit all new technological applications. Yet often, that's all we have. To cite just one example, consider the idea that privacy in cyberspace today and within the government's databases is governed principally by the Privacy Act. Now that sounds good. Who can object to a law named the Privacy Act? But you realize what a problem that might be when you stop to think that the Act was written decades ago, in 1974. Although the Privacy Act expresses some important themes and principles that are still applicable today, it's also true that many of those principles don't fit the current technological capabilities. For the most part, law can never catch up with technology. The development of each moves at wildly different speeds. In a democracy, the drafting of each new law moves through multiple layers, from the private sector and grassroots citizen interest to the public arena, local, state, federal governments, as well as through multiple levels within the public sector. In the federal government, we typically start at the top with the president and Congress and move from drafting and the passage of new legislation to its articulation and implementation by the federal regulatory agencies, whose methods are inherently slow and deliberate. By contrast, technological change is rapid, and it's only getting faster. You might be familiar with Moore's Law, which reflects an observation made by the co-founder of Intel, Gordon Moore, about integrated circuits. Back in the mid-1960s, he saw that the number of transistors that could fit on a chip doubled every year or two, and he predicted that it would continue to double for the foreseeable future. To date, his prediction has been remarkably accurate. Moore's Law wasn't legislation enacted by Congress to speed computer processing times. It was rather a principle of technological development expressed by a private technology executive. And yet, it has held true ever since Moore first gave voice to his prediction, much as any natural law might. 18 to 24 months is about a good approximation of the time it takes to get a new law through Congress when all goes well. And that doesn't count the time it takes for the written regulations that follow inside the bureaucracy. Technology always seems to move ahead more quickly than laws and regulations do. Related to this concern is the inherent conservatism of our legal system. And I mean conservatism with a small c. The Supreme Court is always reluctant to address new technologies with sweeping opinions. Consider Kwan versus the City of Ontario, California, a case from 2010 that addressed the question of whether or not a police officer had privacy rights to the messages on his pager. A pager? Yes, you heard that right. It took until 2010 for the High Court to address questions related to the use of pagers, a technology that by 2010 was almost totally out of date. And despite that, here's what the court said. Prudence counsels caution before the facts in the instant case are used to establish far-reaching premises that define the existence and extent of privacy expectations enjoyed by employees when using employer-provided communications devices. At least that gives us a glimpse of the big picture. The court is talking about employer-provided communications devices, a broad brush technology that could have widespread applications. But then the court stepped back to narrow its view. Quote, rapid changes in the dynamics of communications and information transmission are evident not just in the technology itself, but in what society accepts as proper behavior. As one friend of the court brief notes, many employers expect or at least tolerate personal use of such equipment by employees because it often increases worker efficiency. At present, it is uncertain how workplace norms and the law's treatment of them will evolve. If you ever wanted a great example of the reluctance of the court to rush ahead of technology, this is it. How is this for direction from the Supreme Court? And again, I quote, "At present, it is uncertain how workplace norms and the law's treatment of them will evolve." And that leads directly to a related aspect of the disconnect between the pace of law and the pace of technology that we will also explore in this course. The role of private sector actors in creating expectations of privacy and in defining the role of surveillance technology. After all, almost all the technologies that we will talk about in this course, including tools like drones and traffic cameras and the GPS in your car, are manufactured by private corporations, not some official benefactor like Q in the James Bond films, whose marvelous inventions for the British Secret Service were applied first to defeat the enemies of the Queen and then later, perhaps, sold on the open market. Consequently, since it's private companies that bring us most of today's new commercial technologies and applications, think Apple, Google, Facebook, you name it, they also have the initial responsibility for setting the rules on collection, storage, use, and analysis of the data that the new technology captures. Often, we will find that these private sector guidelines and choices are much more important in determining whether, when, and how your privacy and civil liberties will be invaded than any rule promulgated by the government. Just think of all the privacy agreement updates you get in your email box sometimes, but not always requiring your active consent. Or think of the limits on what you can and cannot publish on Facebook or Twitter. These are examples of the important guidelines and codes of conduct initially established and modified by the private, not the public sector. Now, of course, that's not always true. When the government purchases or invents a new piece of technology, or when it buys data and information from the private sector and then uses it for its own purposes, the question quickly becomes one of governmental rules and controls. Who sets the terms for how the government uses the system? Typically, it's Congress through legislation, or the executive branch through its internal policy and guidance. Sometimes, in the case of conflict, it might be the courts. Nevertheless, at least in the first instance, private actors who are by no means representative of the general populace make many decisions that directly affect how surveillance is accomplished. Unlike elected officials, these private actors take their cue not from voters, but from consumer-driven demands and consumer-driven concerns. It is therefore an oddity that much of what we consider to be issues of great public policy concern in the surveillance space are, in the first instance, shaped by private actors. Our second major theme is the idea of delegated control, a system that reflects how transparency and secrecy are in continual tension. We want to exercise oversight of our secret intelligence operations like the CIA and the National Security Agency. Oversight is fundamental to democracy, and transparency is essential to oversight. You can't control what you can't see. But we also understand that complete transparency, exposing all of their activities to public scrutiny, would frustrate their effectiveness. Methodologies and sources developed by our intelligence community often cannot be publicly disclosed without draining them of all usefulness. That's a conundrum in a democracy. We want to maintain public control of our agencies, but we also want them to be effective at what they do. And so another theme that we will examine in this course is the idea that the American public has delegated to its representatives in Congress and the courts some of the responsibility for overseeing the intelligence community. Something of this nature is, to many Americans, an essential method of auditing surveillance activity without disclosing it. Yet today, many think that this model of delegated transparency is outmoded and ineffective. Especially in light of recent revelations about NSA surveillance of Americans, some think that the current system is too insular. One example is a cloistered federal court system known as the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which Congress established in 1978 to entertain applications made by the U.S. government for approval of electronic surveillance, physical search, and certain other forms of investigative actions for foreign intelligence purposes. Here, the intelligence community is subject to the scrutiny of federal judges, but that scrutiny occurs behind closed doors in sealed proceedings not open to the public. That represents a compromise between complete transparency and complete secrecy. To assess the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court's usefulness, we need to examine some of the situations in which it's been applied in recent years. Only when we've done that will we be able to reach our own conclusion about whether we think it works or not. But whatever you think of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, whether you believe it works or doesn't, behind its creation lies the idea that this type of institution, or something like it, is essential to the way in which democracies exercise control over secret agencies. And that brings us to the final overarching theme in this course. It's the idea that policy and law are created by the clash of institutions, every bit as much as they are by formal legal processes. Often, these are conflicts between branches of government, between, say, the executive branch and the legislature, or between either of them and the judiciary. Beyond this, there are often conflicts even within the executive branch, between, say, the White House and the intelligence community, or between the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. And sometimes, one part of the government is in tension with the private sector actors, who march to a different motivational drummer. Standing in lonely opposition, in some ways, to the government and even the private sector on issues of surveillance and policy is civil society. Throughout this course, we will see how non-governmental organizations and advocacy groups exert a large influence on the development of surveillance law and policy and its application. These include formal organizations, such as the American Civil Liberties Union, as well as informal citizen groups and small communities, which might, for example, simply oppose the flight of drones over their own houses. And finally, we will talk about the role of independent journalism in monitoring surveillance activity on behalf of the public. The press, or media, is sometimes called the fourth estate because it has an outsized role in defining the debate and, to some degree, resolving it. For many people, the prospect of government surveillance is deeply concerning. For others, less so. One thing we need to do, therefore, is spend at least some time looking at the psychological effects of surveillance and what that tells us about how surveillance does and does not affect human behavior. Indeed, some are so distraught at the prospect that they are reacting to the growth of the surveillance state by trying to go off the grid, so to speak. One consequence is that we see greater private use of anonymizing and encrypting technologies as a way of keeping our personal selves concealed from government surveillance. Ours, of course, is not the only way to look at surveillance and security issues. America, obviously, is not the only country on the globe. And many other nations have very, very different concepts of surveillance and privacy. Some authoritarian regimes, for example, really don't understand what the problem is at all. In China today, or in Cold War East Germany, surveillance was far more pervasive and government control much more insidious. Likely in reaction to this Cold War surveillance, others in the European Union today take a much more privacy-protective view of surveillance than we do even here in the United States. We can and will learn a fair bit about current American practices by holding them up for comparison against these two edge cases. Return with me now to John Ashcroft's hospital bedside. Perhaps you can see better than before what makes the story significant. It is a classic example of U.S. institutions clashing over public policy and the legality of domestic surveillance programs. It is emblematic of the conflicts in law, public policy, and government institutions on questions of surveillance and national security. Remember that at the time of this event, the U.S. was fighting two wars, one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq, and was engaging with the specter of terrorism on a global scale. That conflict is a fundamentally asymmetric contest that knows no barriers, no boundaries, and in which the enemy often cannot be seen. As a result, high-ranking officials throughout the Bush administration firmly, and I think quite sincerely, believed that renewal of one particular surveillance program, one which became very controversial when it was later disclosed, was essential to ensuring American security. On the other hand, high-ranking officials in the Department of Justice, whose duty is to enforce the law of the land, believed this program was unlawful. The conflict between the ambiguity of the security impulse and the ambiguity of the law itself plays out over and over again in the contemporary world. And how did this particular story end? John Ashcroft, a conservative former Missouri governor and senator with impeccable law enforcement credentials, had, for the past several years, authorized a surveillance program that involved the collection of Internet metadata. Metadata is data about data. It's not the content of a telephone conversation, for example, but rather information about certain technical aspects of that conversation, such as what phone number was called, what phone number the call was placed from, and perhaps how long the conversation lasted. In this specific instance, the Internet metadata in question was information about web search requests made by individuals and the websites that they had browsed to and the hyperlinks they had clicked on. For a number of years, the U.S. government had been collecting that sort of information from Internet service providers under a program known as the President's Surveillance Program. The Bush administration initiated the program in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 to assist our intelligence agencies and warfighters to track terrorist activity. When initially set up, the program was authorized by a little-known office within the Department of Justice known as the Office of Legal Counsel, or OLC. In support of authorization, the Office of Legal Counsel issued an opinion stating that the President inherently held the authority to authorize this sort of program even though Congress had passed no law expressly permitting it. Some might have said that existing law actually prohibited such an Internet surveillance program. But for now, let's put that aside. At a minimum, the program existed only because of the presidential authorization. Time had passed since the Office of Legal Counsel provided initial approval of the program, and new attorneys had joined the OLC. In particular, one OLC attorney, a Harvard law professor named Jack Goldsmith, had joined as head of the office. After studying the program, he concluded that the original opinion authorizing it was wrong. In other words, Goldsmith concluded that the Office of Legal Counsel analysis was in error and that the President did not have the inherent authority he'd claimed without congressional authorization. So Goldsmith's advice at the time was for the Department of Justice to refuse to reauthorize the program and that the program be shut down. Now, just as this Harvard legal scholar was reaching his opinion, Attorney General Ashcroft had to go into the hospital for emergency surgery. And while Ashcroft was recuperating, the existing order authorizing the interception program came up for renewal. Goldsmith took his analysis to Deputy Attorney General Jim Comey and convinced the department's deputy that the program as constructed was not lawful. Comey, in turn, told the White House that the Department of Justice would object to the interception program's reauthorization unless it were changed to meet the legal objections that had been raised. This, in turn, led to the dramatic events on the evening of March 10, 2004. I've always wanted to say this. It was a dark and stormy night. And here's what happened. According to the Justice Department's Inspector General, The IG, by the way, runs a statutorily created independent office whose mission is to detect and deter waste, fraud, abuse, and misconduct in the DOJ programs. According to the Inspector General, White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card, disturbed by the turn of events set in motion by Comey, rushed to John Ashcroft's hospital bedside with the papers for the ailing cabinet member, a Bush appointee, to sign to reauthorize the program. In other words, the White House wanted the bedridden Attorney General to overrule his subordinate Comey. But Ashcroft had formally given over his legal authority to Comey. That is, while Ashcroft was in the hospital, Comey was not the deputy, but rather the acting Attorney General. And Comey, along with Goldsmith, rushed to the hospital room as well to persuade Ashcroft not to reauthorize the program. Imagine the scene. The president's chief of staff, on one hand, arguing with the emergency temporary attorney general on the other, with the FBI director, Robert Mueller, also on the scene, and somewhat improbably, for a law enforcement official, taking Comey's side in saying that the surveillance program should not be reauthorized. This is no tempest in a teapot, but a gale-like struggle in the inner corridors of the world's most important democracy. And John Ashcroft, as he lay there in his hospital bed, still medicated, told the White House Chief of Staff that he shared his own deputy's doubts about the legality of the program, but that whatever his thoughts were at that particular moment, it didn't matter because, and here Ashcroft raised his hand and pointed at Comey. "I'm not the Attorney General," he said. "There is the Attorney General." With that, Comey refused to reauthorize the program. And the next day, President Bush told Comey that he intended to reauthorize the program anyway, without his approval, on his own authority as Commander-in-Chief. True to his word, a new directive was circulated under President Bush's name the very next day, making the explicit assertion that his authority displaced the existing limits entailed in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, under the rationale that the law, quote, cannot be read to infringe upon the president's constitutional role as Commander-in-Chief, according to a government review of the events several years later. The reauthorization also stated that the NSA could obtain and retain metadata, but that the agency would not be deemed to have acquired those records until the analysts specifically searched for and retrieved them from the larger database. At that point, Comey, Goldsmith, and others all threatened to resign. A version of Nixon's famous Saturday Night Massacre loomed. Perhaps the most notable resignation threat was from FBI Director Robert Mueller. While some in the administration, including the vice president, thought that the program, which went by the code name Stellar Wind, was essential to the nation's security, Mueller was having none of it. He thought the rule of law was the key component of American security. As he said in a speech he later gave, "The rule of law, civil liberties, and civil rights, these are not our burdens. They are what makes all of us safer and stronger." He, too, told President Bush that he would resign if the program continued. A few days after that, President Bush reconsidered. Or you might say he backed down. He modified the program to accommodate the legal objections that Comey and Goldsmith had raised. The program was narrowed to apply only to al-Qaeda and other groups in armed conflict with the United States. And the president dropped his assertion that he could overrule the law based on his presidential authority as Commander-in-Chief. Certain other aspects of the program, still shrouded in secrecy, were reportedly discontinued. And Comey, Mueller, and Goldsmith, in turn, all signed off on the reauthorization. So there you have it, an almost perfect example of an institutional clash driving surveillance law and policy. In this instance, the clash was mostly inside the executive branch itself. It was a dispute between the White House and some former lawyers of the OLC on the one hand, and on the other, the then current crop of lawyers, who had a different view of the legality of the surveillance program. On the other hand, perhaps we make too much of this story. After all, in the end, the program was reauthorized in a slightly different form. And as we will see, in later years, the basic program was reauthorized by Congress. A pragmatist might say that only the labels changed. The substance remained the same. For myself, though, I think the story is significant as an example of the extraordinary ways in which some such conflicts are resolved. I think it is also significant for what it tells us about the American approach to surveillance and about how, in the end, rules and laws matter. Say what you will about the surveillance programs the United States is developing. America, almost uniquely in the world, is struggling with the very difficult and complex question of how to conduct surveillance within the bounds of law. That is a hallmark of the nation's democracy. And that, I submit to you, is the fundamental question that we're going to talk about in this course. Not just the bounds of law, but also the bounds of policy, the bounds of ethics, and the bounds of morality. Everybody thinking about this question will come to it with a different set of conceptions about what that proper balance should be and how competing considerations should be weighed. I know I do. At the end of the conversation, I hope that you'll be able to say you're much better informed about surveillance law, public policy, and technology. You might not change your mind, but you will have taken a deep dive into some of the most pressing and salient concerns our country addresses today. And whatever position you take, maybe you will also have a better appreciation of the other side of the argument.